Support for PhillyCentric comes from Squarespace. Squarespace, for credit card processing on phone and mobile devices. Visit www.squarespace.com/PhillyCentric for a special code providing special offers. PhD and Pearl Productions. This is PhillyCentric. One story told a week at a time. Philadelphia Execution. A true story of murder and American justice by Emmi. Episode 6. A verdict is reached. At this point, Frank's methodical approach became helpful. He said, "I think at this stage we should get all the charges in front of us and go through them one by one." We had the breakthrough we needed. I was now on board with everyone else, and now we started to work the matter backward from the other end. Frank's structured style was working complementary to my questioning approach, at least for now. I tried to kick the legs of structure out beneath the Commonwealth's case and could not. In fact, my approach helped to uncover evidence that strengthened it, which was not my intent. I was thinking independently, out of the box, questioning the strength of the prosecution's case and Frank's rule book. The case and rule book stood up to the test, so the prior friction between Frank and I became resolved, at least for the time being. It was now about 5 p.m. in the afternoon. We had 5 charges in front of us. We could convict on either first-degree or third-degree murder, but not both. The other 3 charges were illegal possession of a handgun, intimidating a witness, and intimidating a witness with money. We started with the lesser charges first, which prompted a discussion about the intimidation during the phone call. I had already determined that Linda Manley was credible, so now I just needed something else to tie into to corroborate her statements regarding witness intimidation. The matter boiled down to a 3-way phone call originating from the jail in the same cell block where Bryant Childs was being held. The call was to Bryant's mother, Ann, and it utilized Bryant's access code. From there, with Bryant still on the line, a call was placed to Linda Manley from Ann Childs' house. Tim said, "Fact, Bryant calls his mother from jail. Fact, his mother calls Linda Manley. We have the Verizon phone records to prove it. It's a fact." I didn't see it as a fact. Highly likely, yes, but a fact, no. Another prisoner could have used Bryant's access code, and this was brought up by the defense counsel. Tim also mimicked the phone conversation in a black, ethnically degrading tone that I thought was unnecessary and inflammatory. He was emotional and was trying to make a point, but I wanted to reel him in, not concerning his content, but concerning his tone and demeanor. It hurt group dynamics and created an obstacle for us to overcome. Tim saw me as being naive, obstinate, and not accepting of the obvious. I saw myself as trying to be as thorough and unbiased as possible in a situation with the highest imaginable stakes. I viewed Tim as being bright, offering valuable insight and contributions, but at the same time fueling emotions. It was a theme throughout the deliberations and made it a somewhat rough ride. The phone call to Ann Childs was 17 minutes long, which also bolstered the idea that Bryant made the initial call. At this point, Vince added something that I had forgotten. Vince said it was a collect call from the jail, and his mother accepted the charges. Would a mother accept the charges of a phone call from a jail cell being someone other than her son? Doubtful. Would she spend 17 minutes on a phone with a prisoner other than her son? Unlikely. Furthermore, would she then call Linda Manley if the originator of the call was someone other than her son? Even more unlikely. Vince's comment about it being a collect call finalized the matter for me. Linda Manley's testimony stood up. There were phone records that corroborated her statements, and I had to conclude that she was being truthful and was accurate. She claimed that Bryant offered her money, and there was no reason to disbelieve her and every reason to believe. Ellen then offered a statement which I thought was valuable, but depending on your frame of reference, could also be construed as racially tainted. She said, "Believe me, it's known that those women in that town will do anything for money. And I mean anything. It makes sense to me that he would try to offer money to her." I think that she was trying to convey that cash was the commodity of trade down there, and with it, you could buy all the area had to offer. Everything was for sale. Jim also added a good piece of information that also may have had racial overtones. He said, "Believe me, I work for Verizon, and those people on welfare have every phone feature available. Three-way, caller ID, you name it. They may not be able to pay rent, but they have every phone feature offered." I think both Ellen and Jim's statements were made to bolster Linda Manley's credibility. I don't think it was their intent to sound racial, and maybe they didn't. But I also thought of how they might have rephrased what they said if we had had a black juror in our jury. That meant Bryant Childs was guilty of intimidating a witness and intimidating a witness by offering her money. If I believed Linda Manley, I had to conclude that Bryant Childs had a firearm, although the gun that was used in the crime was never found. It was established at trial that Bryant Childs was not registered to carry a firearm and had no license for one. Whoever killed Stephen Smith used a firearm. That was a given. We all voted him guilty of carrying an illegal firearm. At this point in time, about 6 p.m., the judge entered the room. He handed out some menus for us to order dinner. We were getting close to wrapping up, so I asked him, "Your Honor, how long will we be allowed to stay here and deliberate?" My question wasn't aimed at total time allowed for deliberation, but if we were allowed to stay at the courthouse until 9 p.m. or 11 p.m., etc. The judge misinterpreted my statement. He said, "You can take as long as you need. There is no time limit. After a certain time, I may inquire as to your progress, but you can take as much time as you like." I clarified what I meant, and he said, "I'll check back with you later, and we'll determine then if you should stay here or go home and come back on Monday if necessary. Why don't you look over the menu first and decide on dinner?" All we needed to determine at this stage was whether it was first-degree or third-degree murder. Both first and third degree required that the crime had malice, which this one did. First degree required premeditated intent. Larry and myself were not so sure about whether this was first degree or a third degree act. Maybe Bryant Childs and Stephen Smith were engaged in an argument. It escalated, and a youthful, immature 17-year-old had a momentary emotional outburst that he would regret for the rest of his life. To me, if that was the case, then this was a third-degree murder. We also did not have a definitive motive. In her closing, Prosecutor Greer said the killing was motivated by a love triangle. She pointed out that Jackson heard the victim and child's quarreling with the words, "I had her first." We all recalled Jackson testifying to that, but none of us gave Jackson any credibility. It may have been over a girl. It may have been a drug deal gone bad. Jackson testified that he sold drugs for Smith that night also. Maybe Bryant Childs was involved in the drug dealing in some way. They weren't studying for exams at 4 a.m. in the morning on the streets of Chester, that's for sure. We weren't told anything else about a love triangle. Martina Wilson did not testify to being romantically involved with Stephen Smith, or that any type of friction existed amongst the three parties. Was it about drugs, money, or a girl? It was all very vague. Without a motive, to prove premeditation was a bit murkier. I asked the group, if this was a premeditated murder, at what time did that premeditation start? Was it an hour before the crime? Minutes before the crime? The prior day? No one had a good answer, and we weren't presented with evidence to make that determination. Factors like these lent themselves to a determination of third-degree rather than first-degree murder. Larry shook his head, stating, "I'm not sure there is enough here for me to find him guilty in the first degree." I initially agreed with Larry. The agree-oppose dynamic on this issue was 10-2, the two holdouts being Larry and myself. That wasn't much better than the previous 11-1 ratio, but 2 was twice as large as 1, so strength on the side of holdout doubled. I think this led more to the group accepting that divergent views are a natural occurrence in a circumstance like this, and that we had to deliberate to make an attempt at merging these views into consensus if possible. I felt a slightly more participatory tone move through the room rather than the previous more antagonistic one. As our deliberations continued, it became clearer in my mind that more evidence pointed to first degree rather than third. Neither eyewitness testified to a heated argument that escalated to violence. Linda Manley said there were a few words exchanged. Stephen then pushed Bryant, and Bryant then shot him twice, the second time while Stephen was falling to the ground. From the autopsy photos, you could see that the first shot to Stephen's head grazed his forehead on his right side. It took a piece of his scalp off, but the bullet was not lodged in him, and only bullet fragments were recovered from the crime scene. This bullet tore through the inside part, or thumb side, of the index finger of Stephen's right hand. In Prosecutor Greer's opening and closing arguments, she reenacted Stephen's pose when this injury was sustained. She put her right hand outstretched, elbow bent at a 45-degree angle, at a height just above her forehead, with her palm turned toward her body. She described Stephen as pleading for his life, trying to block this shot with the back of his hand. She said it all occurred instantaneously, and Stephen raised his arm by instinct in a defensive posture. That may have been the case, but I think it also plausible that Stephen pushed Bryant with his right arm when Bryant jumped out of the alleyway in front of Stephen while he walked up Bain Street. Stephen was startled and instinctively pushed Bryant in an out-of-my-way kind of manner. Bryant then drew his weapon and fired his first shot at Stephen. Stephen's arm was still outstretched, his palm facing away from his body, as it would be if he pushed Bryant. This first bullet then ripped through the inside of his index finger, took off a portion of his right scalp, and felled him to the curb. The forensic evidence was consistent with the theory that Stephen could have pushed Bryant, as both witnesses testified to, and while his arm was still extended outward, Bryant drew his gun and fired the first shot. The forensic pathologist testified that Stephen may have survived this first shot. It did not take much to conclude that this was likely the initial shot. The other shot was directly into Stephen's skull, and an additional shot would not have been needed if that had been the first shot. One had to conclude that the first shot was the one that injured his hand and tore through the right side of his scalp. If Stephen survived the first shot, he may have indeed been able to plead for his life. as Jackson testified to. The second shot Stephen suffered entered his head just above the outside corner of his left eye. This bullet traveled through his skull and ended up on the lower side of his head, just below his right ear. This shot was at point-blank range, and gunpowder residue was on Stephen's skull at the wound's entry point. Linda Manley testified that Bryant shot Stephen a second time in the head while he was falling backward on his back to the curb. Frank, being very experienced in firearms, offered some valuable input. He said, "It takes a few moments to draw a weapon and to point it, from either a holster or even your belt or pocket. Your finger needs to find the trigger, and you need to locate your target. It takes a second or two. This looks like Bryant had his hand on the gun as Stephen approached him walking up Bain Street. As soon as Stephen pushed Bryant, Bryant lifted the gun that was already in his hand. Tim and I then tried to reenact the crime, with me intentionally pushing Tim a few times to replicate an escalating argument. It just didn't add up. The wounds were more consistent with a sudden, unexpected assault rather than one that could have been anticipated via an emotional escalation. We reenacted it a second time, with me pushing Tim and Tim drawing a weapon that he already had his hand on. The wounds indicated that this was the more likely scenario. The shooting also took place on the curb at the entrance of an alleyway. The prosecutor claimed that Bryant laid in wait in the alleyway and jumped out at Stephen to commit the crime. The evidence seemed to support that notion. Under a well-illuminated street lamp, would Stephen push Bryant while Bryant's hand was on a gun? Not likely. I was trying to picture the whole scene in my mind, and then I referred to the detective sketch of the crime scene. Stephen was on his back, with his feet facing north and head facing south. It was consistent with him walking up the street, then having Bryant jump out of the alleyway and shoot him, the second time while he fell back to the curb. The sketch of the dead body looked like he was shot in the same steps that he made walking up the street. This did not bolster the argument that there may have been some type of extended confrontation between the two that escalated to fatal violence. The detective's sketch was invaluable. The words, "This was an execution," unconsciously rolled over my tongue and past my lips. It was the first time the word execution was used at the trial, even by the prosecutor, defense attorney, or any other juror. Frank just nodded in agreement that this was an accurate description. If I had thought about it, I don't think I would have chosen the term execution. It could have been an inflammatory description, and emotions were already high enough. Yet used in the context that it was totally accurate and appropriate. Frank added, "All executions are premeditated." I couldn't argue with that. The judge re-entered the room and asked if we were ready to order dinner. His timing couldn't have been more inappropriate. Food was the last thing on anyone's mind. We just physically reenacted the crime and pieced together the likely gruesome train of events. We made all the pieces fit together into a likely scenario in a fashion even exceeded by what the prosecution presented to us. We told the judge that we thought we were very close and that we would correspond with him again within the hour. Dinner could wait. The whole event unfolded for me differently than it had for the other jurors. Initially, I wasn't sold that there was guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It took our deliberations and a re-examination of the evidence for me to reach that conclusion. I had to move to that frame of mind where the other jurors seemed to already have been there. It was a similar exercise for me with the intimidating a witness charge and the first-degree versus third-degree matter. I first presumed Bryant Childs was innocent, and then I moved to a guilty verdict upon a closer examination of all the evidence. That was our juror instructions. My opinion gradually changed throughout the day, while for the others it was more or less confirming what they had already believed to be true. I didn't come to my conclusions on a wavering route of reasoning. I had to build a logical progression to my final conclusion. I always thought that he was implicated, but I did my best to presume him innocent and examine what was presented to us to make the best decision possible. Although my approach was hard, taxing, and draining, it was thorough. I felt like my mind had made a logical determination, and that if I had made any other conclusion, I would not feel comfortable with my decision. The fact that it coincided with the other 11 jurors was optimal in the pursuit of a unanimous verdict, but not a necessity for me. I knew my thought process was logical and linear, but emotionally, I felt uneasy. Not unsure, but uneasy. I said to the group, "I've gone through quite an unsettling emotional journey today, and I feel like I just got off of a bumpy plane ride. I'm certain I'm glad my feet are on the ground, but I'm still a bit wobbly." Juror number 3 now had all but finished his work, and it was time for the jury foreman to move the process along. I wanted to dot every I and cross every T. I said to the group, "Without inferring how I feel, I think it's appropriate for me to get your feedback on this notion. I'm also a singer-songwriter, and I've found that at times one of the most valuable things I can do for a recording is to give it some time. Step away from it for a few days and come back with a new perspective. I hear, see, and feel things that I wouldn't if I had not thrown the time element at it. Does anyone feel like they may want to take more time with this decision? I'm not suggesting a week, but maybe a few more hours or the weekend. We're talking about giving out the most severe penalty the state allows to a juvenile." Jen quickly broke in. "Dave, we're not giving him the punishment. He gave it to himself. Also, it's sad for him, but it will help Stephen's family to get some closure on this." It was good insight on Jen's part, at a time when I was spent emotionally and could never have thought in those terms. Dick added, "Sometimes before a car purchase, you want to take the night to think it over." Everyone in the group didn't feel like they needed any more time. Frank said, "Dave, I can say that if I had the weekend, I wouldn't change my mind." Everyone else expressed similar sentiment, except, as always, yours truly. I didn't feel like I needed another day, but I felt like I needed another 10 minutes. I just got off of an emotional roller coaster, and I needed a minute before I headed to the amusement park food court. Tim said, "If anyone isn't 110% sure of their decision, then we should take some more time." Larry echoed that sentiment. The group was coming together, and I think in an understated way were coming to my support. I said, "Tim, I'm about 105% sure, and in 5 minutes I'll be ready to go back into that courtroom and give our verdict. Let's fill out these charge sheets." I read the charge sheets out loud, and I needed to circle either guilty or not guilty on each sheet and sign and date them. I read the first charge, intimidating a witness with an offer of money. How do we find him? About 2/3 of the room said guilty, and the rest just nodded their heads in agreement. On the charge of intimidating a witness, we find the defendant. I said the word guilty while I looked into everyone else's eyes to make sure they said guilty also. I thought I caught Ellen just nod in agreement, and I said, "I think we should all say the word guilty." Ellen bit back at me and said, "I did," emphatically. It was a long day, and we were drained. Illegal possession of a handgun, we find the defendant. Everyone said guilty. We didn't need to fill out a charge slip for third-degree murder, since we found the defendant guilty on first-degree murder. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Everyone in the room said guilty. We knocked on the jury room door and told them we had reached a verdict. In a few minutes, a court employee took the charge slips to the judge. We then had to wait about 20 minutes to get all the parties back into the courtroom. It was around 7 p.m. I sat down close to the front of the jury room at the end of the conference table. I was glad we were done, but I was sad about the whole event. I held my head up with my hand, my elbow resting on the conference table. Jen came over and touched my arm in an endearing, supportive type of way. I'm not certain if anyone appreciated my efforts, or if they all felt they just needed to tolerate me. I said to Tim, "Sorry if you felt I was being obstinate. I was just trying to be thorough and to have us make the best decision possible. This isn't something we want to be second-guessing years from now." Surprisingly, Tim was empathetic to my statement. He said, "I just think you were trying to play devil's advocate. I think you did a better job than the defense attorney." I jokingly replied, "Now I said no name-calling while I was talking about respecting fellow jurors." It took Tim a second to realize that I was being sarcastic, but when he did, he grinned and said, "Dave, I thought you did a good job." I don't know if he was just stroking me or not, and at that point I didn't care. Our work was done. I just wanted to get the rest of it over with. I knew it was going to be rough heading back into that courtroom. Bryant Childs, the attorneys, the court reporters, families, all would be looking at our demeanor, trying to predict what we were going to say. I guess the textbook on reading jurors is if they don't look at the defendant, then they probably have a guilty verdict. If they look at him, then they may have found him not guilty. I didn't want to look at Bryant, the attorneys, or the families. I didn't want to feel their probing glances trying to gauge me. I just fixed my gaze upon the judge. I knew that as the jury foreman, I would have to state our verdicts. I also felt that the defense counsel would ask to poll each of us individually for our verdict. The court reporter kept looking at me with an astonished look. Maybe I was reading into it, but I think she thought that we would deliberate longer considering the severity of the charge. We deliberated for about 8 hours. It seemed more like a month to me. The words hanging jury popped into my head. Did we rush to judgment? Should we have at least thought about it over the weekend? Was that too much to do with Bryant's life in our hands? I know that I couldn't have been more thorough, and I was 10 times more so than the next most thorough juror. I was asked to stand in the jury box. I was seated in the front row, directly in the middle. Unpredictably, I felt a measure of security with all of the other jurors around me. I stood straight up and in a deep baritone spoke clearly, "Guilty," the 3 times I was asked to respond to the charges. As I did, Bryant's family wailed out, crying and shrieking, "No!" Stephen's family said "thank you" out loud, although I didn't turn to look at any of them. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Detective Slotnick lip-sync a thank you to Tim. Bryant Childs was emotionless. If an innocent man was just found guilty of first-degree murder, he sure didn't look like it. He just shrugged his shoulders, put his hands behind his back, and was cuffed and led out by a court policeman. The courtroom was cleared, and the judge then spent some time with us. He thanked us and asked us if we had any questions. Ellen asked if we could have a security guard escort us to our cars. I'm glad she thought of that. I was so emotionally spent, I was just going through the motions at that point, and I had absolutely no energy to engage in any type of forethought. We were given certificates of appreciation and led back to the jury room. I wrote my phone number out on a large piece of paper and said anyone who wished to call me was free to do so. I didn't want to solicit a number from anyone, and I didn't want to force mine on anyone either. Being the holdout juror, I definitely had felt resentment at times. But once we came to our verdict, I sensed that some people appreciated the exercise I ran the group through. With the exception of Dick, no one else thanked me, but I had a feeling that, at least to some degree, they realized that my thoroughness would help to ensure they had no regrets when reflecting back upon this experience.
It was 16 days
PhillyCentric, Juror Reflections.